Hello there, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Giulia Pucci, and today we're going to be talking about the LGBTQ+ community. As this video is public, I want to address that I'm a Christian in alliance with the community. That being said, if anyone in my audience shares my faith, I realize that this topic can feel really taboo. So let's just break down these walls and get right into the lesson. To shake things up a bit, we're going to do something you should normally never, ever do. And we're going to exercise some of the stereotypes that we're really afraid to address. Don't worry, there is a purpose to all of this. So take out a pen or pencil and let's get started. This activity goes along with a video on YouTube from a channel called Cut. The premise of this video is that you're going to be guessing the sexual orientation of 9 random strangers. To save some time, I'm just going to show you pictures of the strangers, and you're going to have to write down what you think their sexual orientation is. I'll have a list of terms on the screen for you to pull from, and you can reuse them as often as you'd like. Just pause these parts of the lesson until you have your guesses recorded. This is super informal, so don't worry. Just resume the video whenever you're done. Alrighty, so before we continue on, I wanted to introduce you guys to a good friend of mine named Ben. He and I went to high school together, and I solicited him to be a part of this lesson because he is a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and I thought it would be no better than him to give us some input from his perspective. So for now, I'm going to let him introduce himself, and then throughout certain points of the lesson, I'm going to let him come back in and answer some questions for us. I apologize in advance. I really wanted to show all of his videos, but PowerPoint is not cooperating with me. So instead of showing you the video plus audio, I'm just going to put his audio in and then put a screenshot from his video in. I apologize for that, but without further ado, meet Ben.
Hello, my name is Benjamin Wong, and I currently attend the University of Pittsburgh. I'm studying bioengineering, and I openly identify as gay, and my preferred pronouns are he, him, his. And I just want to take the time to express how grateful I am for this opportunity to educate you and others, to further educate future generations of our society.
Alright, so now let's talk about who is actually in the LGBTQ+ community. Different from the other marginalized groups we've talked about, it's a little bit hard to tell who's involved here. For example, if we're talking about African Americans or Asian Americans, we automatically have someone come to mind. But if you're thinking of LGBTQ+, that is a whole range of people. So we're going to be talking about two huge topics to break that down: sexual orientation and gender identity. Don't worry about taking any notes. Your handout will have all of this information on it, and I did that on purpose. I'd really prefer that you engage during the lesson and learn firsthand instead of worrying about writing things down. And I just hope that the handout becomes a really great tool for you to have on hand in your classroom. First, let's talk about sexual orientation. This is where we get the acronym LGBTQ+, so let's go item by item. Please keep in mind that this is definitely not an exhaustive list. Sexual orientation can be extremely complicated for some people. For now, I'm just going to hit the common and most widely accepted list of sexual orientations, but please just remember that this is extremely surface level. A lesbian is a woman who is sexually attracted to other women, contrasted by a gay person who is a man that is sexually attracted to other men. Bisexual is a person who is sexually attracted to both men and women. Many people right off the bat like to confuse bisexual people for being polygamists, meaning that they date or marry more than one person. That could be the case, but that's determined on an individual basis, not as a whole. The main point here is that bisexuals find sexual attraction in men, and they find it in women, but they can choose to do that monogamously or by dating or marrying one person. Also, if a bisexual person decides to marry somebody that is a man or a woman, that doesn't change their sexual orientation. I suppose on a personal level it could change, but as a whole they can still be bisexual. Now that covers the L, G, and B in our acronym, and for now we're going to skip the T because that is a gender identity, but we're going to go straight to Q. Q can be interchangeably queer or questioning. A queer person usually finds that it's really difficult to express their sexuality. It might be because it changes over time, or it just might not fit neatly into a specific identity. In fact, in the cut video, one of the people I actually identifies as queer, but only dates women. To me, it sounded like this person was a lesbian. But to her, she found that she best identified as queer. That being said, it's extremely important to never assume a person's sexual orientation. When in doubt, it's important to just ask. The term questioning is pretty straightforward. Someone who is questioning is unsure of or contemplating their sexuality. Now we're delving into the plus group. Some people actually extend the acronym to include a couple extra letters, so we'll address one of them. Some people like to include A for asexual. Asexuals don't find sexual attraction in any gender. So now, even with this list, particularly with queer and asexual, things can get really complicated, and especially if you go beyond what we've talked about. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But if you're curious and want to learn more, I really encourage you to search for some videos on YouTube from people who can tell you directly about what it's like. Finally, a straight person is a man who's attracted to a woman or a woman who is attracted to a man. Now, I include that as somewhat of an afterthought just because the LGBTQ+ community tends to identify on the fact that they are quote-unquote different than the norm. And so typically we see straight people as the dominant in this culture. Before we move on, I wanted to touch on a couple other things in sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is extremely personal, and as we delved into a bit with the case of asexual and queer, it can be very, very complicated. Scientifically, there is no known cause to different sexual orientations or genders, as we'll discuss in a second, but here is something I'd like to emphasize. Sexual orientation is not a choice, nor can it be forcibly changed. We'll eventually get to some history later in the lesson, but I wanted to briefly discuss the issue of gay conversion therapy. In other parts of the world, gay conversion therapy can include inhumane medical treatment. Thankfully, that is much rarer in the United States. In the United States, it usually includes extensive talk therapy, hypnosis, and weekend retreats, although that has not always been the case. In the early 20th century, homosexuality was considered a sociopathic disorder that could be treated with psychotherapy. Psychotherapist Sigmund Freud was completely on board until extensive research showed him that homosexuality is not a disease or disorder. Even with his discovery in the 1950s, gay conversion therapy in the United States was predominantly led by electric shock therapy. Today, more and more states are outlawing gay conversion therapy, but it is still legal in over 40 states and is extremely damaging emotionally and psychologically to anyone who has to go through it. Now, in case any of you are curious, I do have one question for Ben, and I'm going to let him address it. So I asked him the question, are you born with it? And by that I meant, are you born having a different sexual orientation, or do you choose to have a different sexual orientation or gender identity? So I'm going to leave that to him.
Very complex question, super simple answer. You are born with it. As someone who is openly gay their entire life, I can tell you confidently that you are born with it. I know there are a lot of preconceived notions and very, very, very traditional religious-based explanations, but I can tell you that I don't think any person would ever want to choose to be so different from others, to ever have to choose a life that comes with a little bit of additional struggles. I don't think any person would want to subject themselves to something like that.
Now let's move on to gender identity. Gender identity is how you feel inside and how you physically and emotionally show your gender. Sex is biological. Doctors will diagnose, quote-unquote, your sex at birth based on your genes, hormones, and body parts. Sex is either male or female. Gender, on the other hand, is how society thinks we should look, think, and act. Gender can be extremely complicated, but on its surface level, we can split gender into masculinity versus femininity. A cisgender, also known as a cis person, is someone who identifies with the sex and gender assigned at birth. I would personally consider myself cisgender because I am a female who expresses herself as a feminine woman. A transgender person is someone with a gender identity that does not match the sex they were given at birth. For example, if a male identifies with a feminine gender identity, then they may consider themselves to be transgender. Remember, gender is how you feel and express yourself. It has nothing to do with body parts or genetics. That being said, the person in my example can be transgender without having had sex reassignment surgery. Something else to consider with a transgender person is which pronouns to use with them. I am personally a cisgender female who prefers the pronoun she/her. The person in my example may call themselves a transgender female who prefers the pronouns she/her. It is not considered offensive to ask for the appropriate pronoun. It's actually considered to be respectful. And don't worry if you make a mistake. Just be sure to address it at some point and apologize. Especially because there are more than just two pronouns to be aware of. Yes, there is he, him, his, and she/her. But depending on the gender identity of a certain person, they may have a different pronoun that they prefer. So just ask them about it. Finally, there is intersex. This is a person who is born with a mix of male and female biological traits. This seems more like a sex than gender thing, right? But I actually placed it with gender because at this point, this focuses on the expression. And you may be thinking that this sounds like a hermaphrodite. I would say that's technically accurate, but I would shy away from the term itself just because the community tends to prefer the term intersex and finds hermaphrodite to be politically incorrect or offensive. Next, like we had with sexual orientation, we have some of the complicated pieces. So also in transgender is gender fluidity and gender queer, gender nonconforming, or non-binary. Gender fluidity is the idea that this person is able to express their gender flexibly. It can change over time. It might even change day to day. So it usually means that they just don't identify with one or the other or any of the above, I suppose. Next, gender queer, gender nonconforming, or non-binary. This is a term for people who don't identify as a man or a woman, or whose gender just doesn't fit the traditional categories. This list is super, super, super extensive, and you can usually just find out on an individual basis. But these are some of the terms that these people might choose to go by. Again, ask them. Someone might be offended by non-binary, but might prefer gender queer. They might prefer something completely different. So again, always be sure to ask. It's usually not offensive if you're approaching them from a place of kindness. I also wanted to touch on gender dysphoria, which is a diagnosis to describe the distress, unhappiness, and anxiety about the mismatch between the bodies and their gender expression. I suppose if you want to draw comparisons, this is kind of the questioning of gender identity. You will probably see this very often in the school system just because youths are typically confused about themselves overall, as we know with the Erikson crises, but especially if they're questioning who they are down to their gender, they're going to be in a lot of distress. This is the term to describe that. Another thing I wanted to hit on, and this addresses sexual orientation and gender identity, is the idea of coming out, which is also somewhat common in youth. I guess from my research and what I've seen online, it seems to be more common in the young adult stage of life. But coming out is the idea of telling someone, even including yourself, about your sexual orientation or gender identity. And for me to come out and tell you all that I am, a heterosexual female, I wouldn't consider that coming out, just because that is quote unquote considered the norm. Coming out is normally very emotional. It can be very difficult. And as it says here, there's also a part where you have to come out to yourself. And so for these people who are enduring gender dysphoria or just this stage of questioning, coming out to themselves can be extremely hard because for them, they're probably enduring some type of criticism or homophobia or something like that that's keeping them from being confident with them true selves. So coming out can be very difficult. For some people, it can also be very easy. Some people are out, as they say, at a very young age. But it all completely depends on the person, the circumstances that they've had to grow up with, so on and so forth. All right, so now that I've bombarded you with tons of information about who is in the LGBTQ plus community in America, let's talk about the trials and tribulations that they've had to endure in a brief history of their time in America. As you can probably guess already, As is true with most, if not all, marginalized groups, the history can be pretty grim. And I've condensed it to like 10 bullet points. There is so much more. And I encourage you to look into it, even though it's very sad to read a lot of it. But before we jump into it, I do want to remind you of something. Homosexuality has been, quote, a thing since like the beginning of time. There's documented cases of it in like ancient Rome. So it is not a trend, it's not a fad, it is not something new. Yeah, so abandon that thought right away if that's anything that's crossed your mind. But for now, we're just going to start in the 1920s, just because this is when a lot of social change started happening, particularly in America. So in 1924, the Society for Human Rights, which was the first documented gay rights organization, was founded in America. We'll jump forward in 1952, how we talked about a little bit with gay conversion therapy. The American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, they decided to list homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. If you recall me saying Sigmund Freud actually debunked this before 1952, everyone ignored him and still went forward with it. So now we're talking about the time period where we have electric therapy, and lots of other dangerous things happening in gay conversion therapy. A year later, in 1953, President Eisenhower bans homosexuals from working for the federal government. About 15 years later, the police raid the Stonewall Inn, which is a building that just represents a lot of gay pride and community in New York City, and that was actually a really pivotal time for homosexual justice. 10 years later, we have the first National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. They had about 100,000 people show up for that, which is incredible. That march still happens. I don't know if you remember it happening, especially a couple years ago. It was a really big deal whenever same-sex marriage was becoming legalized. In 1993, President Bill Clinton starts the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which basically in the military meant that, well, if you're not out yet, then we can't ask you, but just don't tell us because we have banned all out homosexuals. So basically, if you proclaim that you are gay or lesbian, you are not allowed to serve in the military, but if you are still, quote, in the closet, then we can't do anything about it. We're not going to ask you. Just don't tell us or we'll kick you out. In 1996, President Clinton then banned same-sex marriage. In 2011, we finally got Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed. And then finally, in 2015, same-sex marriage has been legalized in all 50 of the United States. Don't get me wrong. Just because I ended the history part with that little bullet point on same-sex marriage being legal does not mean that everything is A-okay in the LGBTQ plus world. There is still a lot of strife, a lot of homophobia going on, a lot of maltreatment, and it's not fair. But we can celebrate LGBTQ plus as a culture so that we know how to celebrate it with them. First, I want to pop in and see what Ben thinks about LGBTQ plus. I want to know if he thinks it's a culture.
Excuse me. LGBTQ plus community is indeed a culture, and what makes it a culture is the fact that it's a group of millions of people who all share common ideals. And these ideals, again, relate back to unconventional love, acceptance, diversity, breaking out of the sense of a society built on heteronormativity. And for those of you who don't know what heteronormativity is the idea that societal, social interactions, media, already kind of built into place that heterosexuality is the normal sexual orientation, the preferred sexual orientation, that there are only two genders on the binary, man, woman, that correlate distinctively with biological sex of male, female. So it's a culture, LGBTQ plus community culture is for those people who don't fit that mold and don't believe in that mold. Realize that there's more to just being a person. There's more to just those things.
I love that Ben sees that the LGBTQ plus community is a culture in and of itself. Now, we talked about how same-sex marriage was legalized in June of 2015. Well, that turned into Pride Month becoming the month of June. And so how fitting is it that I get to actually talk about this at the end of June? You've probably seen rainbows all over the place. That rainbow is a symbol of diversity, of differences, and just ultimate joy in being yourself. The priorities of this culture and this community is accepting diversity, accepting people the way they are, and accepting yourself. And so an overarching theme of acceptance and love is the goal of the LGBTQ plus community. So now finally, all of the buildup, getting a grasp of who is in this community, how they live their lives, what their culture looks like, what they've endured throughout history. Let's finally get to how we can handle these students in our classrooms. First, I want Ben to share a little bit about his experiences in the K-12 system, and then I'm going to show you a second video of other students who have also endured the school system, changes that they'd like to see made, and how they feel about themselves following being in the K-12 system.
I didn't have that many negative effects because I came out so early. I helped develop. I like really got involved, and I didn't encounter a lot of like social problems related to acceptance and kind of stuff like that. So I was very fortunate in that department, I must say. That's not the case for everyone, so that always has to be considered, because there are a lot of people who really struggle throughout high school in that education, and it's not even just based on academics and the curriculum now. But I did notice that I had to push myself and work a little harder to kind of overcome me just being identified as that gay kid, that, you know, that kid who's so different. And it's hard because you're trying to work harder to overcome that and just be as equally respected by the teachers, the educators, the other instructors and people who work there, along with your peers and other students, to be like, oh, hey, this is just another student who I go to school with. He does really well, you know, he's thriving. And that's something I think about often, because even to college, I kind of notice stuff like that I'm not saying that like I'm second tiered, but I always have to push myself to kind of overcome that classic standard of LGBTQ plus mentality in order to push myself even further to be on equal level. So in the sense, I'm like working twice as hard for the same result.
Now this is the second video that I wanted to show you, and it's posted by GLSEN, which is an LGBT advocacy program. They specialize in creating programs like Gay Straight Alliance clubs in schools and stuff like that. And they posted this video called LGBT High School Students Share Their Experiences. It's a great video. It's only a couple minutes long. Like I was saying earlier, though, I've been having trouble embedding videos into my PowerPoints. So if you want to see it, just for some extra enrichment, please look it up. It'll be really worth your time. You can skip right past it if you'd like, but it's here for you. I put it in my bibliography if you want to check it out, and it's here as well. The image on here is what the thumbnail looks like whenever you look it up, so it should be pretty easy to find. Hearing and seeing these testimonies can always be so bittersweet, because part of me is just like so in love with these kids, and then the other part of me is just so sad with the things that they have to endure. Which is why, before we get to what we can do as teachers, I want to highlight the important topic of suicide, because it is particularly rampant in the LGBTQ plus community. It's the second leading cause of death among young people ages 10 to 24. And that's a horrible statistic, right? Well, wait whenever I tell you that LGBTQ plus youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth, and are 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide. They're also 5 times as likely to require medical treatment as those of the heterosexual youth. Also, as adults, 40% of transgender people report to having made a suicide attempt, and out of those people, 92% of them were before the age of 25. These statistics are heartbreaking and absolutely unnecessary, because we need to be there, we need to be advocates for these kids. Because if you notice here, all of these statistics are about young children in our classrooms. There are kids who are questioning at the age of 5. There are kids questioning at the age of 15. So you are not excluded just because you are in elementary education or whether you are in high school education. You are also not excluded if you are teaching in a religious school or in a private school. You are not excluded. So make sure to be looking out for these kids and to be mindful of how you're treating them. So that being said, let's address what we can do as teachers. First, I'm going to let Ben give you some insight of what we can do as teachers, and then I'm going to add on to what he has to say.
But another important thing to bring up that I think would be huge in advocacy, even if it's like absolutely subtle, is to break down these walls of heteronormativity. And it can honestly be something as simple as having, like, if you're having a one-on-one conversation with a student and they're like, hey, this is going on, and you're like, oh, how's like you and your girlfriend or boyfriend, like stating that out regardless of their sex, their gender, or who they are, like stating that out, knowing that like, oh, they didn't just assume, you know, they didn't make it a heteronormative conversation, which is great. And subtle things like that, especially even in teaching, when you're giving examples, scenarios, and like it's subtle and fast and you just continue on, you're treating it like it's normal. It's great. It makes these students feel comfortable knowing that, oh, this isn't just a heteronormative based conversation, lesson, you know, they know that there's more out there, different scenarios, like they're vast. That's the best way I think teachers can advocate, is to use these little subtle things, because it lets students feel more comfortable knowing that their instructors are taking the time to really understand and explore society and open their minds and know what it's like with these younger generations coming up.
I love what Ben highlights here, and I just want to add on to a little bit of that. I think it's really important to start in your school a gay-straight alliance club. That I think could be particularly helpful for high school students. For your younger kiddos, read them books with LGBTQ+ main characters. I'm going to mention a bunch of resources at the end of this lesson. One of them provides a list of books with LGBTQ+ main characters or morals or storylines associated with that, which I think that can be very helpful. Just reading those to your students are not going to turn them gay, just like sending them to gay conversion is not going to turn them straight. It is completely okay to inform them, and if anything, it's just going to help with their peer relations. Another thing to highlight is to always respect pronouns and identities. Never assume, always ask. Take note of their body language and how they respond to you whenever you call them by a certain name. It's always very easy in the very beginning of the school year. Ask if they have a nickname that they prefer to go by. If Maxine would prefer to be called Max and she prefers that masculine identity, let him be called Max. Encourage that. And it doesn't have to be this huge spectacle where suddenly we're at the zoo pointing to Max and making a point out of it. But you can make it acceptable and safe in your classroom for the students to identify themselves. On the same note, also acknowledge that the parents and the guardians of these students may not be heterosexual. It's important to remember to do this in particularly low-income areas too, because sometimes you don't know if they have two parents at home. And on the same token, you can think about that as their gender and sexual identities too, because realistically, you just don't know. So whenever you're in class telling them about permission slips, don't tell them to take them home to their mom and their dad. Tell them to take them home to their guardians. Realistically, can you 100% guarantee that every one of your students has two parents at home that are in a heterosexual relationship? No. Therefore, don't assume. So now, having heard all of this, I'm sure you have a ton of questions regarding the LGBTQ+ community, and that's perfectly okay, and I absolutely love that. And so if you have any questions, you can either redirect them towards me, or you can check one of these resources here. First of all, I want to highlight the Trevor Project. I wish I had time to go on and on about them. If you'd like to learn more about them, where they came from, they have a short movie, I think it's like 15 to 20 minutes, on their YouTube channel, but they are a great source for LGBTQ information. They also have a hotline, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes. Also, Planned Parenthood has tons of really great information, especially to help your students. This might be a good resource to point them if they come to you saying that they're questioning. There's also PFLAG and the Human Rights Campaign Foundation. They both do great advocacy work, especially for the LGBTQ plus community and for other groups, but especially for them. So definitely check them out if you want to hear what they're up to. They were doing a ton this month just because of Pride Month, but regardless, they're always doing great things to help out the community. Next, I want to pass along a couple of resources that will be really good for your students. The first one is particularly good for transgender students, and it's called refuge restrooms. A problem that often arises for people who identify as transgender is that they don't feel comfortable going into a male or female restroom because they don't fully identify with either of those genders. And so Refuge Restrooms is a great app because it's completely free, and it's where people can pinpoint locations of gender neutral or transgender restrooms. So this will help them, especially in areas where they are not feeling very comfortable, they don't know where to go. This app will tell them exactly where they can go. Ironically, the closest place to me is actually the Breen Student Union at Grove City College, so go us, I guess. The other app that I have here is particularly good for your students who are questioning their sexuality. This one is called Pride Counseling. This app has a lot of free resources as well as a paid counseling service with a bunch of counselors that are LGBTQ plus friendly. Now, before we close out, I do want you to dig out that piece of paper that you had where you wrote down your cut responses. I'm going to put everyone's pictures back on the screen, and now that you've learned so much about the community, I'm going to give you a few seconds to change and adjust your answers, and I'll be back in a moment. So don't erase your first answers just so that you can see and compare once I give you the correct answers. Just adjust them, and I'll be back in a few seconds. All right, now I hope that did not give you too much tumult. I hope that you made that through that okay. Because what I'm going to tell you to do now is completely crinkle up that paper and throw it away. Here are the actual answers. I don't expect a single one of you to have had any of them right, because you cannot assume sexual orientation or gender identity. That is the most important theme that I can pull away from this lesson, and I hope that that's something that you've pulled too. Now don't worry, I did this on purpose, so if this second time around you were thinking, I don't know, I feel a little weird about this, or if the first time you were like, I hate just judging people on their appearance, good, that means you're already on the right start. But the point of this was to prove to you that you can't tell. No matter how much research you do, no matter how much you know, no matter how many gay people you know, you're never going to know. And so that's why it's always, always, always appropriate to ask and never assume. So now, before I completely conclude, I want to bring you to something that I read on the Huffington Post. Because like I said in the beginning, I never intended to make you want to change your faith, and I never intended to make you really question it based on this. I do hope that this brought you some perspective. And so I want to read you from Psalm 139. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. We are all made in God's image, and we are all created good. He created us intentionally. So regardless of how you view homosexuality, and whether or not it is a sin, I want to remind you that each and every one of us is created good, and we are created out of God's image. But we are also simultaneously all sinners in our own ways, and that is why Jesus died on the cross for us. And so whenever you encounter these students in your classrooms, I hope this lesson helps you to push any of the prejudice that you hold out of your mind, and that you help this student in the best way that you can. Because as we talked about with some of the trials and tribulations that these students face, you might be the only advocate that they have for them. So remember that whenever you encounter them. And I hope you find a place in your heart for love for them, because they have wonderful things to share with you. To conclude, I want to share with you two of the possibly most important resources that you can share with your LGBTQ plus students. And I hope that you know them well enough that you can share these resources with them when and if they need them. And I hope with your love and guidance that they won't need them. That being said, I still want to share them with you. The Trevor Project offers a toll-free 24/7 hotline for questioning suicidal or scared students. That number is 1-866-388-7386. You can also go online and web chat with them, or you can text them. The other resource is the Suicide Hotline. The number is 1-800-273-8255. And since this video is public, I really urge you, if you are listening to this and if you need these resources, to call either of these numbers or visit the Trevor Project website because they have plenty of resources to help you. Before I go, if you're watching for culturally relevant pedagogy, I urge you to also tweet about the LGBTQ+ community. I know it's not explicitly stated in our syllabus that you need to, but I definitely urge you to because I think this is one of the most taboo groups that we're talking about. And so to break that shell and just advocate for them online, even if it's in a single tweet, I think is a great gateway to opening your hearts to these students in your future classrooms. Now, for one last thing before we go, I just wanted to say a big thank you to Ben for helping me out here today. I don't think this message would have been nearly as impactful without him. So yeah, thank you again to Ben. And for our last clip today, I just want to show you what LGBTQ+ means to him. And I hope that he's speaking on behalf of the community, because if so, then I think it's a beautiful message and it's something that I want to spread. So I'm going to play Ben's video, but this is going to be the last from me. Everybody have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, and have a great rest of your summer. Bye!
What does LGBTQ+ mean to you? Now, LGBTQ+ means to me many things. It means to me the sense of unconditional love, acceptance, the idea of embracing those whom society has not taken the time to understand, who is outcasted. It's all about bringing in people and recognizing that the only thing that makes us all relatable as humans is the fact that we're all distinctly different. And that's what it means to me. That's why I love it so much. And that's why I think it's so important for our society to understand.